Hi, everyone, and welcome to the last lecture for this week. In this lecture, which might be a little bit longer than some of the other ones, we'll be looking at the different ways that languages use morphology. So basically, there's a few different types of morphology that languages will have. So a few different ways that they will build up their words. So that's what we'll be looking at here. Before we get into that and looking at those different types, I want to introduce the concept of what's called a lexeme. A lexeme is a basic vocabulary item. This is what we would think of if we think of the entry in a dictionary. So the example of a lexeme might be talk, but then talked and talking would actually be the same lexeme. They have the same basic meaning. We're just adding on affixes to change something like the tense of the verb. So lizard is the same lexeme as lizards. Adding the plural s on lizard doesn't really form a new vocabulary item. It's just kind of changing the specifics of how we're talking about lizards. So the reason I wanted to introduce lexemes is because some of these types of morphology will reference lexemes. So the first type of morphology I'll talk about that languages use is what's called inflection. So inflection is a type of morphology that does not create a new lexeme, does not create a new vocabulary item. Inflectional affixes will never change the word class of something they're attaching to. So what I mean by that is that inflectional affixes will not change, for example, a noun into a verb. They will not change an adjective into a noun, nothing like that. They tend to be highly productive. So that means that basically they are used a lot in languages and they can attach to a lot of different types of words. And they tend to contribute predictable meanings. So if we're using an inflectional affix, we can pretty much predict what the meaning of the word will be once we use this affix. So examples of some inflectional affixes in English are the S in plural. So we add on the S to the end of plums and say plums are delicious. So it's not changing the class of plum from a noun to a verb. It's staying a noun. We can predict that it'll change it from talking about one plum into talking about multiple plums. So, and then we can also use this plural S on just about any noun as well. So basically this is an example of an inflectional affix because it kind of satisfies all those requirements of being productive. It is very predictable in its meaning, and it's not really changing the class of the word we're talking about. So other examples of this are things like the S we use to tell that we're talking about a specific verb, tense, and number. So we add the S on the end of a verb. So Sharon changes her car's oil herself. Changes is talking about a third person singular subject in the present tense. We add on the ed at the end of verbs. That tells us the verb is in the past tense. We add on the ing to a verb. It tells us that it's in a progressive tense. So another type of morphology, in addition to these inflectional morphologies, is a case morphology. So case morphology is something that tells us the grammatical relationship between a noun and a verb. So common cases that you might be familiar with if you've ever taken a formal Latin class or a German class or something like Russian or any languages along those lines. So some of these common cases are things like nominative, accusative, dative, locative, and instrumental. So basically what these cases are is an ending that will tell us the role of the noun they are attaching to in the sentence. So if a case on a noun is nominative, that's telling us that it's a grammatical subject. If it's accusative, it's telling us that it's the object of the sentence. If it's dative, it's telling us it's an indirect object. A locative case would tell us that this is where the sentence is happening, and along those lines. There's a whole lot of cases out there. These are just some of the more common ones. But I do have some examples of cases in a language that uses them. English doesn't have a whole lot of usage of cases, so I'm giving you an example from Latvian. So in Latvian, we have the word for field, lauka. We have the word for live, dzīvo, and the word for worm, tarps. So lauka has this ending on the end. That's telling us that the action of the worm living is happening in the field. When it doesn't have that on the end, when it's just lauk, then that means that the field is the subject rather than where the action is occurring. So lauk, field, ear is a copula, which is basically a verb of being, and then leals, big. So field is big. We know that the field is the subject because it doesn't have that ending. So we can also see this with like bird. The word for bird has this S ending, putens. So bird, eat, worm. In this case, we know that bird is kind of the subject of the verb. In this case over here, we have putna, bird, now live. Putna, bird, now live, worm. That's what we have there. So the worm now lives in the bird. In this instance, putna, basically the bird is the location of the action. So the worm is living in the bird versus the bird being the subject here, the bird being the location here. So in Latvian, if a noun is ending with this a sound, that's the location of the action. So the worm now lives in the bird because the bird is the location. And we have man, veers, eat, ed, putnu, bird. The bird ends in u because it is the object. The man ends in the s because it's the subject. So different nouns might have different case schemes, but basically case, or these endings here, like the a, the s, the u, those will tell us the role of the noun they are attaching to. So there's a few more examples. We have the a in measure. So that's telling us that the forest or the mej is the location. We have mej, so that's telling us that the forest is the subject. We have vilks, that's telling us that the wolf is the subject. Viru is telling us that the man is the object, so the wolf is eating the man. Vilka is telling us that the wolf is the location, just like the forest is a location here. So the worm now lives in the wolf. So basically using these in languages that have these case endings, we can learn where the action is happening. We can learn who's doing the action. Basically, these will tell us the grammatical role of whatever they're attaching to. So another type of morphological process, in addition to inflection, in addition to case, is the process of derivation. So derivational morphemes are morphemes that will create new lexemes. So basically, we're creating new vocabulary items. So these derivational morphemes or affixes don't necessarily add a predictable meaning, and they can change the word class of a lexeme. So unlike, say, the plural ending of a verb, we can't necessarily predict what the new meaning of the word will be. And this can also change a word from a noun to a verb, or from a verb to an adjective, or something like that. So some examples of derivational morphemes in English that do change the part of speech is something like the ly that we add on to adjectives to form an adverb. So he sings beautifully. We've added on the ly to beautiful, the adjective, to change it into beautifully, the adverb. We see the or the or endings that can change a noun to a verb, like with changing baker, director, things like that. We see the en ending changing an adjective to a verb, talking about blackening a fish. Actually, so sorry, this er to or, that changes a verb to a noun rather than a noun to a verb. So bake changing into baker when we add on the er endings. So we've changed a verb into a noun rather than a noun into a verb. Okay, so adjective to verb, blacken. The able ending can change a verb to an adjective. So understand into understandable. Meant can change a verb to a noun. Less can change a noun to an adjective. And can change a noun into an adjective or a verb. Ing can change a verb to a noun. So all these endings can change one part of speech into another. Some derivational morphemes don't change the part of speech, but they do change the meaning. So the er is a comparative that can change an adjective to an adjective, but so even though we are changing an adjective to an adjective, we're still changing the meaning, even though the part of speech isn't changing. So friendly does not mean the same thing as friendlier. Re can change the meaning of a verb to mean do the verb again. So reunite, it's still a verb, but it has a different meaning. Pre, again, can change something to mean before. So she's taking prenatal vitamins. Natal is an adjective. Prenatal is still an adjective, but one with a different meaning. In and un, those change an adjective or perhaps a verb into another adjective or verb, but they do change the meaning into a negative. Ish can change an adjective into meaning sort of that adjective, but it's still an adjective. So red changes into reddish. So languages can be classified kind of by type and the type of morphology that they use. This is called linguistic typology, where we look at what type of language are we talking about based upon its structural features, or what kind of morphology it uses, what kind of word order it uses. So that's linguistic typology in general. Morphological typology is specifically going to be classifying languages looking at two parameters, what's called the degree of fusion and the degree of synthesis. So this is basically classifying the languages by the type of morphology that they use. So the degree of fusion is going to be the degree to which words can be segmented or separated into separate morphemes. So you can kind of think of this as having beads on a string, where we can keep adding beads to a string, and these beads can be separated. So if you think of these morphemes as beads on a string, the degree to which you can pull the beads on or off would be analogous to the degree of fusion of the language. So basically, if a language uses a lot of different morphemes, then it has a certain degree of fusion. If it uses less morphemes that can't be pulled apart, then it has a different degree of fusion. So some types of languages with different degrees of fusion are agglutinative languages. So agglutinative languages are very easy to segment. This is when we put a whole bunch of different beads on that string. One example is Ilocano, which we kind of looked at earlier. So with Ilocano, we had all those different morphemes that meant something like the person who was doing the action itself, the tense of the action. So basically, we had those separate morphemes that could be pulled apart and put together relatively easily. Fusional languages, in contrast to that, are difficult to segment. So you can't really pull apart fusional languages' morphologies quite so easily. Estonian here is an example of one. where we have the word for leg and the word which is yalg, the word for flag which is lip. So leg or flag. So yala and lipu is of a leg or of a flag. Yalga or lipu is part of a leg or part of a flag. Yalga or lipe is part of legs or part of flags. So basically, what we have here is a set of words in Estonian that we are getting different meanings there, but it's not so easy to pick apart what part of the word means what when we're doing this. So we have yalg for leg or flag. So yalg for leg and lit for flag. Yala and lipu. So basically we've taken away the G and added an A, or we've taken away the P and added a U. Yalga or lipu for part. Yalga or lipe again for part of more than one though. So basically we're having a lot of phonological changes inside Estonian, which kind of indicates that the morphemes are really fusing together and are a lot harder to separate. So this is a more fusional language where we don't have as many beads on the string versus an agglutinative one where we can separate things more easily and we have a lot of those beads on a string. So this degree of fusion is not necessarily going to be cut and dried for every language. Languages can be classified more along a Cline of degree of fusion. So basically that means there's kind of a sliding scale to tell us how fusional something is, where a language isn't necessarily all agglutinative or all fusional. It's more somewhere along this continuum. So Ilocano is very agglutinative. English is a little bit there. French is kind of in the middle. And then Estonian is very fusional. So languages can be somewhere along this continuum. They don't necessarily have to be in one category or another. So there's also something called degree of synthesis. Degree of synthesis looks at how many morphemes fit into a word. So when we were looking at fusion, that's how do the morphemes get put together. Degree of synthesis is when they are put together, how many can go into one word. So we have this example from Vietnamese where we actually have a lot of different words that are essentially one morpheme per word. We have one word for when, one for I, one for come, one for house, one for friend, one for I, one for plural, another for I, one for seize, one for head, one for do, and one for lesson. So when I came to my friend's house, we began to do lessons. So for example, in English, we have we, which tells us the information of I and plural. So the plural first person is we. Vietnamese actually has that separated into two words. So Vietnamese is what's called an analytic or an isolating language, where there's generally one morpheme per word. Something like Yupik, which we looked at before as well, will actually have many morphemes in a word. So this is what's called polysynthetic. So their word for kayak is just kayak, basically. But then they have their word for two small kayaks, just this one word here with a few other morphemes. So in English, we had three words for that. They have one word for he is making a small kayak, one word for I wish to make him a small kayak, one word for whenever I wish to make a small kayak. So this can continue all the way up to one word for it seems he did not strongly wish to make me a small kayak, but actually he did. So that whole thing is one word in Yupik, whereas as you can see in English, we take several words to say the same thing. So a polysynthetic language will cram a whole lot of morphemes into one word, whereas an isolating language will separate them into multiple words. So again, this is going to be kind of along a continuum. These don't have to be absolute concepts, but we can have something that's more isolating, something that's more polysynthetic. Something doesn't have to be necessarily in one category or another. So that's the end of what I have for you for morphology. Next week, we will be looking at, I think, word classes. So basically, parts of speech is one way to put that. But there's kind of a way that we'll look at them that may be slightly different from how you looked at them in grammar classes growing up. So this week, there's not a discussion. There is a quiz to take. So make sure you take the quiz by Sunday. The first homework assignment also should be up under the assignments tab at this point. You haven't seen everything you'll need to finish that homework assignment yet. You may be able to do much of it, though. So, yeah, if you have any questions about morphology, be sure to let me know. And hopefully the material isn't too difficult right now. The phonology and the phonetics was probably the most difficult part. So as we move on and look at larger structures of language, things will start to look a lot more familiar. It's just that kind of when we look at these smaller bits of language, things are a little more abstract. So we'll start seeing things that might be more familiar and more kind of interesting to some people as we move on.